What if the greatest cities of the ancient world are not buried beneath desert sands or tangled in jungle vines, but resting silently beneath the sea? What if temples, harbors, and homes still lie hidden just offshore, preserved in salt and silt, their stories unread and their builders unnamed? For centuries, the ocean was seen as a boundary, a vast and final edge. But what if it has been hiding something else all along? In this journey, we will follow paleo shorelines that once pulsed with human life. We will walk the seafloors of lost villages. We will trace walls that stretch for hundreds of feet underwater, carved before the first bricks of Egypt were laid. We will visit a city near the Nile swallowed by the sea. We will witness the submerged streets of Greece. We will stand beside a monument in the Pacific that may not be natural at all. Each site challenges what we think we know about when civilizations rose, about how they built, about how much they lost, and in each case, we will ask a question that echoes across millennia. How do you map a world that no longer exists? What happens when memory drowns? And is the past ever truly gone if it still waits beneath the waves? The expedition begins now, and the sea is ready to speak. The salt air still clung to my vest when I stepped onto the deck. The morning was quiet, just the hush of water and the occasional cry of a gull tracing circles above. The sea stretched out like a mirror, hiding secrets in its calm reflection. But beneath those ripples, deep below the surface, there was another world. A forgotten world, a place where forests once stood, rivers flowed, and people walked under open skies. 12,000 years ago, this was not ocean, it was land. Broad, sweeping plains stretched from what is now the English coast all the way to the heart of mainland Europe. Across the globe, sea levels were much lower. The Ice Age had locked water in great sheets of frost, holding it back from the edges of the world. Humanity built its life on these lands, never knowing the tides would return. Today, I stand above it all, floating where hunters once tracked deer through morning mists. I lower the sonar rig into the water, watching its light pulse outward in silent waves. The readings begin to return, gentle slopes, old riverbeds, even the shadows of what may be ancient hearths. I stare into the screen and imagine the wind sweeping across long-forgotten grasslands. This region, now part of the North Sea, was once called Doggerland. To our ancestors, it was simply home. We find traces here and there, a bone fragment caught in a fishing net, a worked flint tool nestled in a scallop dredge. These are not accidents. They are remnants of a submerged world that once connected Britain to the continent, a land that slowly drowned inch by inch, year by year, until only the waves remained. All across the planet, these sunken landscapes lie hidden beneath the waves. In Southeast Asia, vast tracts of land once joined the islands together. In what is now Florida, the coastline extended far into the Gulf, and in the Persian Gulf Basin, evidence suggests a possible cradle of civilization now sleeps beneath brine and sediment. I close my eyes and try to hear it. The voice of the past carried on the tide, children laughing in reed huts, hunters crouching in tall grasses, the first flickers of human belief, of myth, of language taking shape beside the fire. All of it swallowed by a sea that rose not in a moment, but over centuries, long enough to notice, too slow to stop. Somewhere out there, just beneath our feet, lie villages preserved in silt, footpaths hardened by time, campsites where stories were shared under stars that still shine above us. They are not gone, only hidden, waiting. Modern technology gives us glimpses. Sonar maps the seabed like an archaeologist brushing away the dust. Submersibles trace the outlines of ridgelines that were once trails, but every discovery raises a question. What was lost when the world reshaped its borders? What memory drowned with the shore? I sit at the edge of the boat and trail my fingers through the water. This is not just ocean, it is a memory, a veil drawn over the first chapters of our shared story. Beneath this surface lies a continent of echoes, a library of forgotten lives, sealed not by time, but by tide. And yet, something lingers, a whisper, a shape beneath the sediment, the trace of fire-lit gatherings, of stone tools scattered in the soil, of lives lived fully and deeply in a world that no longer breathes air. I do not know what I will find on the next dive, but I know this: the ocean does not forget. It remembers in layers, in silence, in silt. And if we listen closely, we may hear the voices of a world before the waters came. The sea was calm that morning, a sheet of dull silver under a sky the color of lead. Our vessel rocked gently above the submerged plains of the Baltic, a place where few ships linger and even fewer eyes have gazed below. But beneath this quiet surface, something ancient waited, something deliberate, something massive. When the sonar images came through, they startled us into silence, a long line of stones stretching in perfect formation across the seabed, not scattered, not random, each boulder spaced with uncanny precision. It was not a ruin of walls or temples, but a line, like a fence or a pathway, vanishing into the murky gloom. At first glance, it looked like a natural ridge, but the spacing was too even, the size of the stones too consistent. Over 1,000 feet in length, buried under nearly 70 feet of water, the structure sat motionless, wrapped in layers of time and silt. I stared at the screen and felt that familiar pulse of discovery, somewhere between awe and disbelief. We were just off the coast of northern Germany, in the Bay of Mecklenburg. The sonar scan showed not just stones, but something older still. Beneath the structure, the traces of a landscape emerged. Shorelines, patches of marsh, the kind of land where early humans might have hunted and gathered. What we were looking at was not just a wall, it was a survival tool, a guiding structure built during the last ice age, perhaps by hunter-gatherers tracking the movement of reindeer across the tundra, stones placed in sequence to direct the herds, to funnel them toward traps or ambush points. Not just architecture, but strategy. The dating placed it at nearly 11,000 years old. That makes it one of the oldest large-scale structures ever found in Europe. Not built with mortar or grand design, but with instinct and experience, shaped not by empire, but by need. I imagined them moving through misted plains wrapped in fur, watching the herds from behind tall grasses, placing one stone, then another, over years or generations. Quiet work. Patient. No writing. No monuments. Just the slow, precise language of stone and path. And then, the world changed. The ice melted. The seas rose. Bit by bit, the land was consumed. What had once been forest became marsh, then lake, then bay, and finally sea. The wall sank beneath the waves, invisible for thousands of years, forgotten. I lowered the camera drone into the water. It drifted slowly toward the shadow of the structure. The stones came into view like teeth in the dark, some upright, others half buried, covered in algae, yet still unmoved. I reached out on the monitor as if I could touch them through the screen. This was not the work of chaos. It was the ghost of decision. What strikes me is how subtle it is. No fanfare, no carvings. just a silent thread stitched across the seafloor. But its existence rewrites a chapter of our understanding. It tells us that even in the deep past, humans were building at scale. They were thinking in lines, in systems, in landscapes. They were not just surviving, they were shaping their world. As I stood above it, listening to the creak of the hull and the soft lap of water, I could feel how little we truly know. The Baltic hides more than this. There may be other structures, other maps etched in stone beneath the waves. We have only just begun to see them. And yet, even one line of stone, built in the time before the sea, is enough to remind us. History is not always told in books or cities. Sometimes it sleeps in the quiet places, and sometimes it stretches in silence across the floor of the sea. The morning sun rose over the Mediterranean like molten gold. Its light caught the edges of the harbor as we prepared to descend. We were floating just offshore from the Egyptian city of Alexandria, in the Bay of Abu Qir. But our destination was not modern. It lay beneath us, hidden beneath layers of sand, salt, and silence. The dive began in stillness. As I sank beneath the surface, the world grew quiet. The color shifted from bright to muted green, then deeper, colder shades of blue. But then, shapes emerged. First, faint and ghost-like, then sharper, more defined. Columns, archways, fragments of stone statues covered in sea life, their faces worn smooth by time. This was Thonis Herakleion, once one of Egypt's greatest port cities. Along with its sister city, Canopus, it thrived at the mouth of the Nile for centuries. Long before Alexandria rose to power, this was the place where trade arrived from across the ancient world. Greek merchants came with goods and gods. Egyptian priests watched the tides and held rituals for deities whose names are older than written script. But now, the city is silent. Its roads are lined not with sandals or chariots, but with soft silt and drifting fish. Yet the bones of it remain. Stone docks stretch into the emptiness. Temples rest half buried in sand. Great statues, once lifted to honor kings and gods, now lean in the underwater gloom, their hands extended toward the sea floor. I hovered near one such statue, a red granite pharaoh, toppled but still majestic. I reached out and brushed away the seaweed from its crown. The features were worn, but the expression was calm, regal, as if he too were waiting. What caused the fall of these cities? The answer lies not just in myth, but in the earth itself. Over centuries, the land beneath the delta began to shift. Soft clay compressed under its own weight. Earthquakes rattled the coast. Parts of the land simply gave way. The buildings cracked. Water surged in. What was once solid ground became mud and lagoon. The sea crept closer with every year. Then came the final blow. A tremor, a surge. Walls fell, pillars snapped. In a matter of days, perhaps even hours, the city was gone, swallowed by the water and forgotten. For centuries, Thonis Herakleion lived on only in whispers. Ancient texts spoke of a city where Heracles once walked, where Helen of Troy and Paris may have sought refuge. Scholars debated its location. Others dismissed it as legend. But in the late 20th century, divers found the first clues: a carved slab, a sunken ship, then more. Piece by piece, the city returned. As I explored the ruins, I felt as if I were trespassing in a sacred space. Fish darted through old doorways, eels curled between shattered columns, but the layout remained. Roads, courtyards, sanctuaries, not just a city, but a civilization frozen in its final breath. I surfaced slowly, light breaking over the waves, but part of me stayed below. The weight of it lingered, the knowledge that even great cities, even gods carved in stone, can be taken by time and tide. And yet they endure in another form, not through conquest or survival, but through rediscovery, through the quiet persistence of the sea, which keeps secrets for those willing to look. Beneath the Egyptian waves, history does not rest. It drifts. It waits. And sometimes, if the light is just right and the water still enough, it rises again. The tide was out when I stepped onto the shoreline. The reeds swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the salt air carried the scent of the open sea. To any passerby, it looked like any other quiet stretch of Italian coast. But I knew the truth. Just beyond the shallows, under a thin veil of water, the stones of a vanished harbor waited. The sea was calm that day, clear enough to see the outlines beneath. Long lines of stone, almost geometric in shape, stretched just below the surface. The water shimmered over ancient quarried blocks. Some were still in place, others slumped under the weight of centuries. They were too clean, too uniform to be natural. This was a harbor once alive with sound and purpose. Now it was hushed, wrapped in sand and memory. Les Cézannes lies on the Adriatic coast of southern Italy, not far from modern Lecce. Today, the area is a nature reserve, known for its wetlands and migrating birds. But in antiquity, this stretch of coastline served another role. It was a port, a small one perhaps, modest compared to Rome or Carthage. But it was built with care, designed for function, and once bustled with life. As I waded into the shallows, the seabed shifted from soft sand to something more solid. My foot struck a submerged block, shaped by human hands. I leaned down, brushing it clear. It was part of the quay wall, once a foundation for wooden piers or moorings. The stones still held their line, reaching inland, pointing to a time when boats tied up here and offloaded goods from distant coasts. What they traded, we cannot say for certain. Amphorae, oilfish, perhaps stone or textiles. What we do know is this: the design of the harbor suggests planning, rectangular enclosures, protective barriers, cut channels where boats once moved through the tides. It may have been Roman or even older, but its use spanned generations, centuries even, until the sea began to take it back. The Mediterranean is not still. Over time, coastlines shift, rivers carry sediment, tectonic plates sigh and groan beneath the surface. At Les Cézannes, it was likely a mix of rising seas and sinking land. Slowly, the water advanced, not in a single wave, but in the quiet, persistent motion of tide and erosion. The harbor was abandoned, not all at once, but piece by piece as boats found safer moorings, and the sea reclaimed the walls. I dove just beyond the old breakwater. Fish drifted lazily through the water, algae clung to the stones, but if you looked closely, you could see the plan, the structure. It was not ruins in the chaotic sense. It was a blueprint softened by time, a human fingerprint left on the ocean floor. There were no inscriptions, no statues, no mosaics to dazzle the eye. Just walls, foundations, the kind of architecture built to serve, not to impress. Yet in their simplicity lies their beauty. These stones tell a story of daily life, of hands lifting rope, of feet on stone, of voices shouting orders over the sound of surf, and now they lie forgotten. As I surfaced and turned back toward the modern coastline, I could still see the past in my mind. A port, not lost to disaster, but to time. No fanfare, no tragedy. Just a quiet fading into the sea. La Cizine reminds me that not all ruins fall. Some are slowly erased, and yet, even in silence they endure. Beneath the Mediterranean sun, just beneath the water's edge, the bones of the harbor remain, waiting for eyes to find them, for memory to return. The sea near Laconia was unnaturally still that morning. The surface, like blue glass, barely rippled as we drifted above the southern coast of Greece. Just beyond the curve of the bay, beneath less than 10 feet of water, the bones of an ancient town waited. Pavlopetri, a name modern archaeologists gave to one of the oldest submerged cities ever discovered. As I slipped into the water, the silence of the deep greeted me. The seabed sloped gently, and almost immediately the layout of the city came into view. Roads, foundations, courtyards, like a ghostly fingerprint pressed against the floor of the sea. The sand had preserved it well. What the tides had touched, they had not destroyed. Each outline I traced told part of a story. Stone walls marked out rectangular houses. Open squares where markets might have once thrived sat quiet and still. Even the bases of clay storage jars remained in place, half sunk in the sediment. This was not just a scattering of ruins. It was an entire town, intact in its design, preserved not by intention, but by the sea's reluctant grace. The town dates back to the early Bronze Age, over 5,000 years ago. Long before classical Greece, before the Parthenon, before even Homer's tales were passed down, this place was alive. People lived here, families, traders, craftsmen. They walked these paths under open sky. They gathered near hearths and watched the stars in the same constellations we see today. I followed what once would have been a main road, flanked by buildings that may have served as homes or shops or shrines. Every step felt like stepping through time. This was urban planning long before it was expected. The alignment of structures, the placement of wells, the organization of space, all spoke to a people who understood their environment, who built not just for survival, but for community. No one knows exactly what they called their town. Pavlopetri is a modern name, a placeholder for something long forgotten, but the artifacts pulled from its sands hint at a trading culture. Pottery from Crete, stone tools from the mainland, beads and ornaments carried across waters. This was not a backwater settlement. It was a node in a network, a part of a world we are only beginning to glimpse. And then came the sea. Geologists believe a series of earthquakes caused the ground to sink, slowly at first, then more suddenly. Combined with rising sea levels, the town was gradually overtaken. The people likely had time to leave, time to pack what they could and retreat inland. But they left behind the skeleton of their world. Unlike many other ancient sites, Pavlopetri was never rebuilt. No later civilization layered stone upon stone. No conquest, no fire. Only abandonment. That stillness preserved it, locked it in a time capsule beneath the surf. As I floated above its rooftops, I felt a profound calm. Not sorrow, but a kind of reverence. This was a place that had lived its full arc. Rise, flourish, fade. It had not vanished. It had simply fallen asleep beneath the waves. Back on the boat, the coastline seemed timeless. But I knew now what lay just beyond that gentle surf, a doorway to the past, a memory in stone. Pavlopetri does not shout its history, it whispers. And if you listen carefully, it will tell you how humans once built lives beside the sea, and how the sea, in turn, kept the story safe. The water off the coast of northern Israel was warm, the kind that glides over the skin without a sound. Just beneath the surface, beyond the reach of beachgoers and fishing boats, the past waited in perfect stillness. Not the ruins of empire, not temples or towers, but something quieter, something older, a village, a dream from the Neolithic. Atlit Yam rests under less than 30 feet of seawater. When you descend, the first thing you notice is how complete it feels. Not in grandeur, but in presence. Stones still stand where they were placed. Walls still form the rough perimeter of homes. Even the remains of a well sit untouched, its lip rising just above the seabed. The silence is not empty. It is inhabited by memory. Over 8,000 years ago, this was dry land, a coastal village set along a natural spring. Its people fished these waters, hunted game inland, and grew crops on nearby soil. Their tools were simple: flint blades, bone needles, mortars for grinding grain. But the way they lived, the rhythm of their days, is something we can still sense in the layout they left behind. I hovered above a cluster of dwellings, square outlines barely buried in the sand. Here a mother might have prepared a meal. There a child chased shadows at dusk. The smoke of a hearth curled into evening skies no longer visible. Even now, traces of grain and seeds remain in the sediment, offering quiet proof of their routines. What was once alive now rests in layers of silt, and then there is the circle. At the center of the site stands a ring of 7 stones, each over 3 feet high. Set in a perfect semicircle, these upright slabs surround what was once a freshwater spring. Some believe this was a ritual site, a place of gathering, of offering, of reflection. I passed my hand over one of the stones, its surface worn smooth by time and tide. Whatever they believed, whatever they whispered in that sacred space, the sea now holds it close. The story of Atlit Yam's end is not one of fire or invasion. It is a quieter tragedy. The sea rose, not in a single surge, but gradually, relentlessly. Climate shifted. The shoreline crept inland. Bit by bit, year after year, the village became unlivable. Salt water intruded into the spring. Storms grew stronger. Eventually, the people moved on. But they did not dismantle their world. They left it whole, as if they knew the sea would come to preserve what they could not carry. Archaeologists have even found skeletons here. Burials undisturbed, still arranged with care. A mother and child, curled together in eternal rest. Their bones have told us of ancient diseases, of care given, of grief that spans centuries. As I floated above the site, time folded inward. The soft push of the current echoed the breath of people long gone. This was not a myth, not a legend. It was a place as real as any we walk today. And for reasons we are only beginning to understand, it survived, not in ruins, but in stillness. Atlit Yam does not shout for attention. It waits. A Neolithic village held in the arms of the sea. A chapter from our earliest memory, hidden not beneath stone, but beneath water. The story it tells is not just of loss, but of continuity. That wherever humans live, they leave behind something of themselves, a pattern, a footprint, a hope. And sometimes, if we are quiet and the water is clear, we can still find them. The Aegean air was thick with salt and the scent of distant rain when I arrived at the western shores of Anatolia. Here, where the modern town of Izmir now watches the sea, the coast hides something older. Just beyond the shallows, beneath layers of mud and tide, lies a harbor that once served a world in motion, Liman Tepe. The name today barely stirs recognition. But beneath its waters and surrounding soil are the remains of a settlement and port used continuously for thousands of years. A place where Bronze Age sailors tied their boats to hand-cut quays, where traders stepped onto dry stone after journeys from Cyprus, from the Levant, from the distant shores of Crete. Standing on the beach, it is hard to picture. The coastline has shifted, the harbor has silted over, the sea is no longer where it once was. But with the right tools and the patience to listen, the story begins to unfold. I joined a team of divers and archaeologists who have spent years charting this forgotten port. As we drifted just off the shore, sonar revealed outlines below, rectangular cuts, mooring basins, even timber preserved in the seabed, blackened with age but intact. These were not random formations. They were shaped with intent. The infrastructure of a society that had already mastered maritime trade before history began recording it. Limantep predates the written word in this region. It stretches back to the early Bronze Age, perhaps even earlier. The site has seen layers of occupation, cultures rising and receding like the tide, each one leaving behind tools, ceramics, structures, and most importantly, their relationship with the sea. I held a piece of pottery in my hands, brought up from the silt. Its surface was smooth, the design faint but present. The style was unmistakably Cycladic. That meant it had traveled. It had been carried by hand or ship across leagues of open water to find its way here. This was not a provincial outpost. It was a node in a complex web of seaborne exchange. What fascinated me most was the continuity. Many ancient cities were born, flourished, and vanished. But Limantepe endured. It adapted. The harbor was rebuilt, expanded, reinforced. As ships grew larger and trade routes evolved, so too did the port. It was not just a harbor. It was a record of human resilience. But the sea is patient. Over time, storms eroded the shoreline. Sediment clogged the channels. Earthquakes shifted the land beneath. And eventually, the harbor slipped beneath the surface. Not lost in catastrophe, but in the slow weight of years. Now it sleeps beneath shallow waters and layers of silt. Divers move carefully here, brushing away centuries with every stroke. What they find is not just stone, but story, anchors of unfamiliar design, amphorae resting like whispers, wooden stakes where moorings once held firm. As I surfaced, the light was beginning to fade. The hills above the coast were golden with evening. And I thought about the sailors who once watched the same sky, waiting for winds to shift. Limantepe was their threshold, their beginning and their return. Today, it is quiet, but its memory holds fast. In every shard, in every submerged beam, there is a trace of a time when the Aegean was not a boundary, but a bridge. This harbor did not disappear. It endured. And even now, the tides of knowledge rise again, revealing what the sea once covered. A harbor of time, a monument to movement. The waters off the southern coast of Yonaguni, Japan are deceptively clear. Sunlight pierces through the blue with startling clarity, illuminating the coral reefs and dark rock below. But hidden beneath those waves, swept by fast currents and mystery, lies one of the most debated underwater sites on Earth. The first time I saw it, I was not prepared. The stone face rose out of the seafloor like something from a dream. Flat terraces, sharp corners, steps cut so evenly they seemed carved by machine. I hovered above it, heart slowed by awe. I knew the debate. I had read the reports, but seeing it in person, that was something else. They call it the Yonaguni Monument, a vast formation of sandstone sitting beneath the Pacific, just off Japan's westernmost island. It stretches over 300 feet in length, with levels and platforms rising and falling like a sunken ziggurat. Some sections drop off in vertical cliffs, others present rows of near-perfect 90-degree angles, rising like the base of a forgotten temple. For decades, experts have asked the same question. Was this formed by nature or carved by human hands? Geologists argue it is natural. The region is full of tectonic activity. Earthquakes have split and shifted rock for millennia. Sandstone, they say, breaks along clean fractures. Water and time sculpt sharp corners. What looks like architecture might be coincidence. But then there are those details. Channels cut straight across stone, a rectangular pool aligned to the cardinal points. Patterns of holes that seem too regular for chance. And then, fragments of carved stone scattered nearby. Tools found in shallower layers. Petroglyphs on adjacent rocks above the surface. The currents around Yonaguni are swift and unpredictable. Diving here is difficult. The structure sits nearly 80 feet underwater at its deepest point, and the visibility, though clear, can change in moments. Yet each dive reveals more. Not just the monument itself, but the surrounding area. Stair-like formations, broad flat plains, what some call a road. If this was once on land, it would have stood as an imposing terrace or pyramid, a ceremonial center, a platform for ritual or governance. But to believe that, you must also believe it is older than most known civilizations. Sea levels in this region began rising over 10,000 years ago. That would place Yonaguni's origin in a time long before writing, before pyramids, before most of what we call history. I ran my hand along one of the stone ledges. It was cold and rough. Algae brushed against my wrist. Above me, bubbles rose toward a world that had forgotten this place. I tried to imagine who might have stood here, if anyone did, what they would have seen, what drove them to carve rock on the edge of the sea. And if it is natural, how strange that something made by blind forces could mimic the hand of man so precisely. There are no easy answers here. That is the power of Yonaguni. It resists definition. It asks questions of both science and myth. Some call it Japan's Atlantis. Others dismiss it outright. But beneath the surface, the stone remains. As I surfaced, the wind had picked up. Waves slapped against the boat's hull. I looked back at the coordinates, already plotting my next dive. The monument had spoken, not in words, but in presence, silent, immovable, ancient. Whether carved by people or born of stone and water, Yonaguni is a message from a time we do not understand, and perhaps that is what makes it sacred. It stands not as a monument to certainty, but to mystery, waiting for those who choose to descend and listen. I stood at the edge of the modern shoreline, staring out over the waves. Behind me were cities, roads, and history we could name, but in front of me, beneath the slow roll of the sea, stretched a landscape we had only begun to understand. Not just water, but a world erased. Paleo shorelines. The term sounds clinical, precise, but the truth they reveal is anything but simple. They are the forgotten coastlines of Earth's past, lines etched in the seabed where land once kissed the sky, where humans built homes, hunted game, and watched the stars rise over dry ground that is now drowned in silence. 12,000 years ago, the world was colder. Vast ice sheets stretched across continents, holding the oceans in their frozen grasp. Sea levels were more than 400 feet lower than today. Whole regions now underwater were once thriving ecosystems, forests, grasslands, river deltas teeming with life. And in the midst of all this, people. They followed herds across the plains, they fished rivers now gone, they built shelters near lakes that no longer exist, and they moved with the rhythm of seasons on lands we would now have to scuba dive to reach. In every corner of the globe, the sea has quietly stolen their footprints. As the ice melted, the waters rose. Not in dramatic floods or crashing waves, but in slow, relentless inches. The change happened over centuries, long enough for generations to adapt. But eventually, inevitably, the sea claimed what had once been theirs. And when the tide erased their world, it also buried their stories. In Europe, the plains of Doggerland once connected Britain to the mainland. In Southeast Asia, a vast continent called Sundaland linked islands that are now scattered. In the Americas, the Gulf Coast stretched far beyond its current line. The same story plays out across every ocean basin, a story not of myth, but of memory submerged. I joined a research vessel mapping the floor of one such region. The sonar painted images and sound, riverbeds winding beneath the sea, ancient shorelines now 100 feet underwater, traced like scars on the seabed. On some, we find artifacts, tools, bones, remnants of hearths. On others, only silence. What strikes me most is how little we have explored. More than 70% of Earth's surface is underwater, and only a fraction of that has been studied in detail. We talk of lost cities and sunken temples, but the truth may be even more profound. Entire chapters of human history may lie hidden in these drowned landscapes. Stories older than civilization, cultures without names. And as we search, we must also ask what it means. How much have we built our understanding of the past on dry land, never realizing that the true heart of human migration, of early development, might rest offshore, beyond reach? The sea is not just a barrier, it is a vault. I sat on the deck one evening, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sea turned gold, then purple. It looked eternal, but I knew it had moved, inch by inch, reshaping the map of humanity without a sound. Beneath its calm surface lies a shifting truth. Paleoshore lines remind us that history is not fixed, that what we know today is shaped by what remains visible. But the rest, the cities, the paths, the dreams, they may still be out there, beneath the waves, waiting not just to be found, but to be remembered. There is a moment just before the dive begins when everything slows. The gear is ready, the water is still, and the sea waits like a curtain drawn over another world. I took a deep breath and stepped off the platform, letting gravity and salt water carry me into silence. What I was about to see did not belong to legend or fantasy. It was real, and it was massive. The structure stretched beneath me like the foundation of a sunken city. Blocks of stone, some the size of small cars, arranged with purpose, aligned, anchored, settled into place with a weight that defied the currents. This was not nature's casual work. This was design, hidden engineering. Across the world, under oceans and bays, we are beginning to discover these submerged megastructures. Not isolated fragments or random ruins, but coordinated constructions. Walls that run for hundreds of feet, harbors with carved channels and breakwaters. Foundations shaped by minds that understood form, function, and endurance. One of the most striking examples was found in the Baltic Sea. A stone wall more than half a kilometer long, buried beneath 20 meters of water. It was not defensive, it was not decorative, It was a guide, perhaps to direct animals during the hunt, or to lead travelers across once frozen plains. That structure alone predates most known civilizations. Off the coast of Egypt, in Abu Qir Bay, the remains of ancient piers and ceremonial walkways still hold their geometry. They formed part of the lost cities of Thonis and Herakleion, whose engineers carved docks to accommodate ships loaded with goods from Greece, Rome, and beyond. Some of these harbors show an understanding of tidal flow and sediment control far more advanced than we once believed for their era. In southern Italy, submerged near Le Cesine, portions of a Roman port remain intact. Carefully placed stones still mark out loading platforms designed to endure shifting coastlines. In Japan, at Yonaguni, the scale of the sunken steps and terraces evokes a structure built to impress or to serve a function we have yet to decode. But not all of these structures are confirmed. Some walk the edge between known history and the unexplained, and that is what makes them powerful. What links them all is the scale, the human effort. These were not the casual works of small tribes or scattered groups. They were coordinated projects. That means leadership, labor, knowledge passed from hand to hand, a vision held across generations, and above all, an awareness of the land that would one day be lost to sea. These structures challenge the way we think about ancient technology, not because they are impossibly advanced, but because they reveal capability where we once assumed simplicity. Early peoples were not just surviving, they were shaping, measuring, building with materials meant to last. In some cases, those structures endured long after the people themselves moved on. I surfaced slowly, the image of the site still vivid behind my eyes. I thought about the work, the sweat, the planning. These stones were never meant to be hidden. They were meant to serve, to support, to stand. And now, the sea has turned them into whispers. But we are listening. With sonar, with satellites, with divers and remote eyes, we are beginning to map the ghost architecture of the ancient world. And the deeper we look, the more we realize how much lies below the surface. The walls, the harbors, the foundations, they are not ruins of failure. They are monuments to memory, to resilience, and to the quiet brilliance of those who came before us. The sea does not rise only with the melting of ice. Sometimes it rises with the shifting of stone, with the buckling of land beneath our feet, with the silent, patient pressure of the earth itself. I was standing on the deck of a research vessel in the eastern Mediterranean, gazing out over a glassy horizon. Beneath those calm waters lay the wreckage of cities, not ruined by war, not burned by invaders, but dismantled by the ground moving beneath them. Entire coastlines lost, not to tide alone, but to the shifting bones of the planet. The science of submersion begins in the soil, in fault lines, in sediment layers, in the quiet data pulled from cores and probes. When I joined the team surveying the Nile Delta, I saw firsthand how subtle the process could be. The land there is soft, built from the slow outpouring of the river over thousands of years, but soft ground sinks, slowly, imperceptibly, but inevitably. The cities of Thonis, Herakleion, and Canopus did not vanish overnight. Earthquakes shook the foundations. The clay beneath them compressed. As the sea level rose, the land fell, the balance tipped, and what had once been temples and markets became seabed. In some places, like the Bay of Naples, volcanic activity adds another layer of threat. The ground can rise and fall like a breath held too long. It is called bradysium, slow motion upheaval. Ports built at sea level have found themselves stranded above the tide or drowned below it. Pompeii was not the only casualty of Vesuvius. Elsewhere, tectonic forces ripped land apart. In the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean, plates grind against one another in quiet fury. Sometimes, that pressure releases in an instant. A quake shatters a coastline. Land drops several feet in a moment. If that coast was a settlement, a harbor, a home, it may never rise again. And then there are tsunamis. Not the crashing Hollywood waves, but real ones, born from earthquakes or underwater landslides. When they hit, they do not just drown, they erase. They push sand and sea deep inland, swallowing everything in their path and depositing layers of debris that seal the past in muddy silence. Our technology allows us to read these stories in stone. Sediment cores pulled from beneath the seabed show layers of organic material, charcoal, shell, and silt. A sudden spike in marine content tells us when the sea surged. Pollen records reveal what was growing, or what stopped growing, and radiocarbon dating helps us place it in time. But this is more than geology, it is human history written in mud and pressure. In places like Portus, the ancient Roman harbor near Ostia, we find evidence of constant adaptation. The harbor was dredged, reshaped, rebuilt again and again. But eventually, the river shifted, the land changed, the empire moved on. In other places, there was no time to adapt. Towns vanished, people moved inland. The sea gave no explanation. As I walked across a tidal flat that had once been fertile farmland, I pressed my foot into the silt. It felt spongy, alive. The earth is not still, and where it moves, civilizations rise or fall. The Science of Submersion is a story of tension between permanence and change, of humanity trying to root itself in a world that refuses to stay still. And beneath every wave, every layer of sand and clay is the evidence of that struggle. The sea does not forget. It records everything, and now we are learning to read. The sea is not just a boundary. It is a pathway, a mirror of movement and exchange. And beneath its surface, scattered across bays and buried in silt, lie the remnants of worlds once connected by trade. I was floating above the site of an ancient anchorage. The stones below were nothing ornate, just carved blocks, weathered amphorae, and faint traces of mooring posts. But to me, it was the image of a network, of people and goods moving across the water, linking distant shores with hands and hulls. When we think of trade, we imagine bustling ports, packed markets, coins clinking, and ledgers full of names. But long before writing, before money, there was trade, a silent negotiation between communities. Shells passed for salt, obsidian for grain, resin for cloth, and the traces of these ancient exchanges now rest beneath the waves. In Greece, beneath the shallow waters of Pavlopetri, we find storage jars and transport vessels aligned beside house foundations. Many of them carried oil, wine, or spices. They were not local, they came from afar, across the Aegean, perhaps even farther still. Off the coast of Israel, at Atlat Yam, divers recovered stone anchors and fishing weights alongside imported goods. These villagers were not isolated. They were participants in a web that stretched across seas. They may never have sailed themselves, but they touched what came from beyond the horizon. At the harbor of Limentipe in modern-day Turkey, we see more direct evidence. There, layers of settlement reveal a port active for thousands of years. Tools, pottery, and materials from across the eastern Mediterranean tell of long-standing commerce. Not empire-scale trade, but consistent exchange, generation after generation. That rhythm, once broken, leaves an economic silence. Even in places like the Nile Delta, submerged cities like Thonis and Heraklion whisper of transactions across cultures, Greek ships in Egyptian ports, temples that collected tribute from merchants. Gold and silver, yes, but also grain, timber, linen, and perfume. Trade was not luxury, it was survival. And then the sea rose. The harbors flooded, the markets vanished, the docks sank, their stones loosened by salt and time, and with them, the infrastructure of economy disappeared, not just physically but in memory. Communities that once thrived through trade became isolated, or faded entirely. What is remarkable is how much remains. Amphorae still line the seafloor in some places, their contents long since consumed, but their purpose still clear. Stone anchors lie like punctuation marks across ancient routes. Even the grooved paths of ship ramps, carved into coastal rock, survive beneath sediment and coral. In studying these submerged networks, we learn not just what people traded, but how they fought, what they valued, what they risked. A community that built a port did not see itself as an island. It looked outward. It planned for contact, for possibility. I held a shard of imported pottery, the glaze faded but still beautiful, and wondered whose hands had passed it along, who had brought it by boat, lifted it from a dock, carried it into a home. It was not just an object, it was a link, a message from one culture to another. Trade leaves behind no grand monuments, but it leaves something just as powerful, a pattern, a flow, a suggestion that the ancient world was more interconnected than we ever imagined. Beneath the sea, those lines still exist. Not in ink or stone, but in fragments, in cargo, in ports that lie quiet yet not forgotten. And when we map them, we begin to see the ancient world not as a series of isolated places, but as a living network, one we are only beginning to understand. The waves whispered as they passed under the hull. Above me, sky. Around me, water. But below was something else. Not ruins or relics this time, but echoes. Memory, not always visible, yet present all the same. The kind of memory that wears the mask of myth. For as long as humans have told stories, they have spoken of lands lost to the sea, of cities swallowed by waves, of worlds that disappeared without warning. And at the heart of many of these stories is one enduring name, Atlantis. Plato wrote of it first, in words older than empires, a powerful island civilization, advanced and proud, that fell into moral decay and was drowned in a single day and night. Some say it was allegory, a warning wrapped in fiction. Others believe it is a distorted memory, passed through time, of a real place taken by the sea. We have searched for Atlantis across continents, in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, even under the ice of Antarctica. Yet the myth persists not because of where it was, but because of what it represents. The fear that the ground beneath us is never truly solid, that the sea, calm one moment, can take everything the next. But Atlantis is not alone. In the North Sea, between Britain and Europe, lies a drowned land called Doggerland. 10,000 years ago, it was forest and meadow, a vast stretch of low-lying plain where animals roamed and people lived. They hunted, built, raised children, and then the sea began to rise. Bit by bit, the water came. Rivers became estuaries. Hills became islands. Until one day, perhaps after a sudden surge from a distant landslide, the last of the land vanished beneath the waves. What remains now are fragments, bones caught in fishing nets, tools dredged from the seabed, and stories, unspoken, sealed in mud. Doggerland is real. Its loss is written in the layers of earth and sediment, but it feels mythical. It is a land we cannot visit, only imagine. A lost continent hidden beneath shallow waters, rich with history and utterly silent. And there are others. The Mahabalipuram temples in India, said to have once stood in a line of 7, only one of which remains above water. The legends of Canchor Gwaelod in Wales, a sunken kingdom with bells that still toll beneath the waves. The tale of Ease in Brittany, swallowed when its gates failed. Stories born in fear and salt, passed down like warnings in the night. What if these myths are not fantasy, but memory? Transformed across generations, embroidered by imagination, but rooted in truth. The sea remembers. It covers, but does not always erase. Its floor is a library without lights, and sometimes we stumble across a page. I floated above a sonar scan of the seafloor, lines revealing a former coastline now more than 100 feet underwater, once a place of trees and firelight, now buried beneath silence. And I could not help but wonder what names those people gave it, what stories they told about the stars, what myths they carried as they watched the tide creep closer. We think of history as written, as carved in stone, but much of it has been whispered instead, carried in legend, preserved not in monuments but in memory. And when those memories align with the science beneath the waves, we find something profound. That maybe myth is not the opposite of truth. Maybe it is truth remembered differently. And perhaps the sea is not only a destroyer but a storyteller. It holds our oldest fears, our deepest losses, and the whispers of lands we still see in dreams. The water does not judge. It preserves and it destroys. It can bury a city with silt and time, protecting its bones for millennia, and it can scour away a temple's face in a matter of years. In the deep, the past lives in tension, balanced between silence and exposure. I remember descending off the coast of Greece, near the ruins of Pavlopetri. The sun above cast gentle bands of light that danced across the seafloor. The ancient town stretched around me, its foundations intact. Streets, walls, the shapes of homes and marketplaces. It felt as though the people had only just left. But around the edges, damage was beginning to show. Not from time, but from now. Anchors dropped carelessly from tour boats. Propellers stirring sediment that had been still for 5,000 years. And beneath the surface, nets and plastic drifted like ghosts. The paradox is sharp. Water can preserve what air would destroy. No wildfires, no scavengers, no erosion from wind. And yet, as we explore these sites with modern tools, we risk disturbing the very things we hope to protect. Preservation underwater is a race against time. Not geological time, but human time. Coastal development, pollution, climate change. In some regions, rising seas threaten to submerge ruins that have stood dry for centuries. In others, fishing trawlers unknowingly tear across ancient streets buried in shallow sand. I spoke with archaeologists working off the coast of Italy. Their site, once a Roman port, had been exposed by shifting tides. It should have been a moment of celebration, but what followed was uncertainty. With more exposure comes more risk. Looters, tourists, storms that hit harder than before. Each stone uncovered must be documented, studied, and protected as quickly as possible. And often funding lags behind discovery. Technology helps. Drones and photogrammetry allow us to map without touching. Sonar can trace the outlines of buried structures, but equipment cannot replace stewardship. The real preservation comes in decisions, in policies, in education, in reminding the world that these places matter. There are wins. In Greece, Pavlopetri has become the world's first underwater city to be fully digitally preserved. In Egypt, collaboration between international teams and local divers has led to new discoveries and careful site management. In Turkey, researchers have found creative ways to involve communities in protecting their own submerged heritage. But elsewhere, the story is more fragile. There are sites we may never reach in time, places too deep, too remote, or too politically unstable to explore. Their stories remain unheard, their stones unrecorded, and slowly they dissolve into nothing. I returned to the surface one evening, the salt still on my skin. The sun had slipped low and the sea shimmered like glass. I thought about how easily we forget what lies beneath, out of sight, out of mind. And yet, these submerged places hold our earliest blueprints, our first cities, our first connections across water. They are not just ruins, they are roots. To preserve them is not to freeze them in time. It is to listen, to witness, to carry their story forward. The sea will always shift, it will always take. But what we choose to remember, that is in our hands. And in the quiet spaces between wave and stone, we are still deciding what survives. The sea holds more secrets than we will ever uncover. That has become clear to me with every descent. Each dive begins not just with preparation, but with humility. Because in this world beneath the surface, we are always guests. And the stories that await us have waited far longer than we can truly grasp. I stood on the deck at dawn, the sky still tinged with silver. We were far from shore, miles out over a part of the sea that no tourist map would ever name. The equipment hummed quietly. ROVs were ready. Sonar arrays blinked to life. This was no longer archaeology with brushes and picks. This was archaeology with light, sound, and code. Technology has changed everything. Where once we could only guess at what lay beneath, we can now see through darkness. Multi-beam sonar paints the ocean floor in color and contour. It reveals walls, shipwrecks, and riverbeds long buried. Photogrammetry allows us to recreate submerged cities in perfect digital detail. Every stone, every pathway, as if the water itself had vanished. Remotely operated vehicles reach depths no human diver can survive. They glide through deep trenches and forgotten valleys, carrying cameras and sensors. They find not just shipwrecks, but entire landscapes preserved beneath the pressure. What once took lifetimes to chart, we can now record in a single expedition. But this technology does more than see, it listens. Acoustic sensors detect anomalies in the sediment. Sub-bottom profilers peel back layers of earth to show what lies hidden beneath. Drones skim the surface and scan with LiDAR, revealing old coastlines, lost harbors, even walls built by hands that vanished millennia ago. Each new tool becomes a key, each signal a whisper from the past. And yet, despite all this precision, discovery still feels magical. I remember watching a screen as the ROV lights cut through the gloom. There it was, a row of stones, too precise to be natural. Another wall, another chapter, another silence waiting to be broken. What strikes me most is that so much of what we find was never meant to be lost. These were not hidden places. They were towns, ports, gathering sites. They were built to last, to be seen, to be lived in. Only time and tide made them mysterious. Only water turned them into riddles. Now, we are turning back toward the sea, not with myths and guesses, but with maps and algorithms. And with that comes responsibility, because with every dive, we open a new door. We learned that the ancient world was more connected than we thought, that people were building, traveling, and trading across vast distances long before we believed it possible. And with every discovery, we must decide how to protect what we have found. The underwater frontier is not just scientific, it is ethical. It is about preservation, about cooperation, and about respect for the people whose histories we are now uncovering. The deeper we go, the older the world becomes, and the more it reminds us how little we truly know. But still, we dive, we search, we listen, because beneath the surface of the sea lies not just the forgotten past, but the shape of our shared story, a story that did not begin on land, a story that has always belonged to the water. And in that vast, dark frontier, the next discovery is always just ahead. The sun is lower now. The sea, once restless with the promise of discovery, has grown still. I sit by the edge of the water, my journal open, salt crusting the corners of the pages. There is a quiet here that only comes after the work is done, or at least paused. What we found on this journey were not just ruins, they were reminders. Stones shaped by hands, cities designed to live in harmony with the tide, ports that welcomed distant voices, villages that held firelight and silence. And in each one, a sense of presence remains. The ocean, it turns out, is not a graveyard. It is a vault, a keeper of memory. It does not forget what was built along its edge. It does not erase without leaving traces. It simply waits. Each dive showed us more than structures. They showed us choices. The decision to build, the decision to stay, the impossible decision to leave when the water rose. Those people left behind more than tools and foundations. They left behind a part of themselves, their rhythm, their hope. And now, it is our turn to listen. We live in a time when coastlines are shifting again, when seas rise once more, slowly, steadily, just as they did before. The difference now is that we have seen it happen. We have the stories, we have the proof. From Doggerland to the Nile, from Yonaguni to Pavlopetri, the past is no longer silent. As I close my journal, I realize that this is not the end of a chapter. It is the beginning of many more. There are still places to explore, still maps to redraw, still voices beneath the waves waiting to speak. Another piece of the puzzle, another secret swallowed by the ages. But I have learned one thing on this path. History does not whisper, it waits.